Chapter 1. Know the boy. Understand the man. Pain is weakness. Emotions are weakness. These are some of the phrases that were once screamed at British Army soldiers whilst they were participating in arduous training exercises such as bayonet fighting. You were taught to block out your emotions, to fight through and go beyond what you believed was physically possible and ignore pain. Then, if you cannot successfully achieve this level of emotional and physical numbness, you are unreservedly deemed as being weak and weeded out. So, I ask the question, why is this type of training important, and what, if any, are the lasting psychological effects? The answer is a simple one. The British Army requires its soldiers to act and feel like machines through behavioural psychological training. Warfare is a brutal and unforgiving environment where soldiers are required to kill other human beings without question, hesitation, or any conscious thought for that matter. You are rigorously drilled to react, almost as if programmed. Yes, this made us, man for man, the best army in the world. But what was the psychological aftermath for not only those who went through this rigorous psychological training, but those who had to implement it throughout 2 decades of persistent warfare? The British Army tends to focus their training methods on lessons learned from the most recent wars or conflicts. In my case, my training was primarily derived from the brutal attrition battles that occurred in the Falklands War, and also the counter-terrorist lessons learned from the Troubles in Northern Ireland. My generation would use these lessons as a platform to prepare us for 20 years of constant deployment. In my case, I would be deployed on 6 operational tours of duty within a 14-year period that would ultimately see me injured in Afghanistan. After being medically discharged from the British Army in 2015 as a result of a spinal injury, I gradually began to become actively involved within the injured veterans community in Greater Manchester. It was mainly through my involvement with charities such as Help for Heroes, SSAFA, and the Royal British Legion that I got the impression that this huge veterans community was not being represented and was, subsequently, being silenced and ignored. Veterans would inform me of their struggles with their ongoing medical care from either their physical or mental injuries, and more often both. They would complain about their daily struggles due to the lack of support and continuation of medical care that they were receiving. After all, let us not forget that these veterans groups are funded by charities and not the government that sent them to war. This made me question what the government and politicians actually did to support our veterans. Apart from publicly laying a wreath once a year at Remembrance, what do they actually do? Where is the support? Initially, I found I almost resented this situation and chose to ignore their stories, as this was not the post-military life and future I had envisaged for my family and myself. The majority of these veterans had become extremely bitter and disillusioned over time due to their poor aftercare, and, as such, had begun to regret their military service. I was still a proud soldier at this point, clinging to the identity and purpose that the British Army had moulded me into throughout the past 2 decades. I refused to contemplate their outlook, as I didn't want the same mindset to engulf me over time. Looking back, I knew that I had underlying mental health issues, and I subconsciously acknowledged that once I let go of my military identity, let go of Colour Sergeant Watson, that I would face a new battle. Not against a foreign army, but one within myself. Therefore, I chose to ignore their screams for help and stood firm on the more palpable narrative that the Ministry of Defence is loyal to its soldiers and veterans community. I had never been fascinated by politics and didn't particularly agree with either of the main national political parties. I had voted Labour in my early years, but as I grew older, got married, had started a family and had a mortgage, my voting trends favoured more towards the Conservative Party. I was a swing voter who would vote on what I believed was best for the country at that particular time. In the veterans community, I had heard firsthand shocking stories concerning far too many veterans and their treatment and frequent failures when challenging the government regarding their aftercare. Regardless of the political spectrum, the very institutions of both our local and national government were failing our veterans, and, as a result of this, the relationship between the two had become fragmented. Our veterans, my brethren, were failing because the political system didn't understand their needs and concerns. Nor did they want to, for that matter. Veteran suicide rates were going through the roof, and our veterans were being publicly persecuted from historic allegations from Northern Ireland to the more frequent conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. It was due to this lack of representation that I decided to get involved in local politics. My intention was to become a local councillor so that I could represent this community and, if elected, my aim was to simply help one veteran, to save one life, and to make that small difference. Once elected, I immediately raised my concerns about the ongoing pandemic of veteran suicide and the lack of mental health support that was available. This new position as a local politician allowed me to make immediate and substantial change by raising awareness to support local veterans who were struggling with their mental health. Within my first year as a local councillor, I had achieved my initial aim. But this was not job done. One local veteran who was suffering with severe post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, informed me that I had prevented him from taking his own life by just being there for him and simply listening to his concerns. It was this new appointment that allowed me to influence Wigan Borough Council's Health and Social Care Scrutiny Committee to annually review our armed forces community. From an annual report in February 2021, from the strategic manager of Wigan's Armed Forces, one particular point stuck with me. From this local study, in 60% of all veterans diagnosed with PTSD, their battlefield trauma was associated with childhood events. This got me thinking about my own continuous battles with my mental health and the therapy that I had received. My therapist was constantly probing into my childhood, which at the time I didn't understand. I was aware that growing up, I had a troublesome and neglected childhood. But I never really delved into it because, in my perspective, it was normal, and I just accepted it. I suppose, if you know the boy, you will gain a better understanding about the man. So, subsequently, that is where we must begin. I am told that on the day I was born, it was a cold, grey and depressing Tuesday evening in late 1978. A typical winter's night in northern England. My mother would often joke about how red I was when she gave birth, as she was convinced that it was due to her heavy appetite for rum throughout the pregnancy. I was the third of 6 siblings from a devoutly Irish background, which categorically specified that I would be raised as a staunch Roman Catholic. Quite ironic, really, considering that 4 of us were conceived out of wedlock to different fathers. As a baby, I contracted meningitis and was admitted to intensive care. I was read my last rites by a priest, as I was not expected to make it through the night. Everyone had given up on me. Doctors, religion, and even my family. They were preparing for the inevitable. My immediate death. Spoiler alert, I survived. I suppose even as a baby I was defiant and didn't respond well to authority and being told what to do. This character trait would remain with me throughout my childhood and military career, and would heavily influence some of my life-changing events. Even as a child, I had never fully committed to the concept of religion, as it seemed forced upon me by my parents, as it had inevitably been forced upon them beforehand. Despite attending church every week and even becoming an altar boy for a short time, my home life contradicted every teaching within the Bible. Then in the summer of 1999, I turned my back on religion for good, as a direct consequence of personally witnessing the ethnic cleansing that had occurred in what would eventually be known as the country of Kosovo. Even to this day, I have trouble comprehending what had occurred in Kosovo. How one group of people could conduct such atrocities on each other because of different ethnicities and religion. Furthermore, the main instigators had been the Serbian Christians, who made me question what little faith I had left. Whilst serving, I observed that religion was a convenient commodity for many soldiers, with many seeking out the Lord in times of reassurance, which, more often than not, coincided with dangerous operational tours. This was their prerogative, of course, but I personally found this to be quite the paradox. My early childhood had consisted of both mental and physical abuse that were direct consequences of my parents' drug and alcohol misuse. My upbringing was quite a simple one of neglect and abandonment, which, if I am being completely honest, would rationalise my dependency as an adult towards not just being part of the British Army, but my drive to being successful within it, regardless of the cost. As a small boy, it was not uncommon to be left alone for long periods without food or attention. Then there were the physical beatings that were a regular occurrence from both my mother and father. And they got quite creative, ranging from belts to slippers, or whatever was close at hand. As a result of these beatings, I have many scars and burns, but I have no memory of how they came into existence. Frequently, this was a blanket punishment. If one of us did something wrong, then we all shared the punishment. It was no surprise that I eventually concluded that if I was going to get punished irrespectively, then I may as well have committed the wrongdoing. Bearing this in mind, it would come as no surprise that I became quite troublesome and, more often than not, used violence to expel my frustrations as a teenager. Whilst growing up in 1980s Britain, there was a persistent prejudice towards the Irish community due to the ongoing bombing campaign by the Provisional Irish Republican Army, IRA. The IRA were constantly attacking the military, with Chelsea Barracks and Hyde Park bombings being the most significant of my early childhood memories. Serving personnel were an easy target. And then there was the potential assassination of the Prime Minister and her cabinet at the Conservative Party conference at the Grand Brighton Hotel on the 12th of October 1984 to contemplate. These bombings by the IRA would establish a deep hatred and prejudice towards the Irish community in Britain. I would often be bullied and ridiculed due to my Irish heritage, and was encouraged by my father that, regardless of how many they were or how old, I had to fight for family and Irish honour. Over the years, and due to this inexcusable advice, I would like to think that I won more than I lost, because if my father ever got wind that I lost a fight, then a more severe beating waited for me at home. At times, I frequently sought out conflict as a means to get my father's attention, and, in a particular way, to try and make him proud. Ironically, I spent a summer throughout this period on a family farm in Sligo in Ireland, and found myself fighting almost on a daily basis because I was, quite frankly, English. It was evident that I wasn't accepted by either community due to my Irish blood and English heart. In today's politically correct society, this would not have been tolerated. But in the 1980s, it was just accepted. Now, as a proud father myself, reflecting back on this period of my childhood, I have trouble understanding why my father remained in the UK, as he had such a love and passion for Ireland. Why didn't he simply move back to Dublin, as he never appeared to have any love or passion for Britain, let alone his family? My father died over a decade ago. Needless to say, no tears were shed, and I didn't even attend the funeral, let alone grieve. There was no love lost there once I was old enough to understand what a shocking father and appalling role model he actually was. My only outlet as a child was school. This was escapism, where I could be a completely different person from the scoundrel that I had become at home. My Irish heritage was rarely the topic of conversation, as my primary schools were always Roman Catholic, which meant many Irish families attended. The reason that I say schools as a plural is down to the fact that my father would frequently beat my mother so badly that she would leave him in the middle of the night, and we would move into a shelter before eventually being relocated in a new area. Then routinely, once we were settled, like clockwork, my parents would make up, and the cycle would inevitably repeat itself. I attended so many schools as a child that I honestly couldn't recite them if I tried. This destructive cycle would culminate in both my parents being imprisoned at the same time. I suppose that this was the trigger for social services to become involved, and would eventually result in myself being admitted into a children's home. My father was already serving a long jail term sentence for assault at this point, and this had left a void in my mother's life. One of her many flaws was that she always needed a man in her life, a man that she would always prioritize over her children. One significant day, I recall that she had been out early, drinking with her current boyfriend, a man almost half her age. After the usual drunken argument, and despite being heavily intoxicated, she had driven home, but had hit a young girl with her car directly opposite our house. My mother was heavily under the influence of alcohol at the time, and was a frequent drink driver. She had been banned from driving previously, and had not learned her lesson. She then abandoned the scene, leaving this poor girl injured in the road, but not before parking up, entering the house, and ordering me not to answer the door under any circumstances. Hiding in plain sight was her ingenious plan. Within minutes the police were banging on the door, and, like the loyal son I was, I didn't hesitate. I opened the door and pointed the police in the direction of my heavily intoxicated mother, who was on the toilet at the time. One could say that she was literally caught with her pants down. I was appalled and ashamed of my mother's actions. I remember watching neighbours and passers-by help this girl lying helpless in the road, and wanted my mother to acknowledge the consequences of her actions. As I watched the police arrest my mother, I was more concerned about the girl in the departing ambulance. I often wonder what injuries she sustained, and how this incident affected her life. For my mother, she never showed any signs of guilt or remorse for that matter, and I doubt that she ever will. My mother would eventually be released early from her brief prison sentence due to the fact that she had children to take care of. It wasn't long after that she got herself a new man, and her inevitable cycle of self-destruction would start over. However, things had changed. I wasn't a small child anymore. I was an angry teenage boy who could challenge and be intimidating to my mother's partners. This would culminate in an ultimatum that I proposed to her, a decision that would indivertibly mould my future. In no uncertain terms, I had told her to choose between her partner or myself. I had blindly gone all in a life-changing poker game without even looking at my cards. I was certain that I had an unbeatable hand, and that the winning pot would be the realization that my mother should prioritize her children over whatever boyfriend she had at that particular time. Later that afternoon, I found myself bemused in the custody of social services, and I never played poker again. It was no surprise that I ended up in a children's home. My only astonishment was that it had taken social services this long. I did not do drugs, and I wasn't a thief, but I was violent and had, by this point, already been expelled from 2 secondary schools for constant fighting. I had missed almost 2 years of schooling, and my education appeared to be limited. But despite these setbacks, I always remained in most of the top sets when I was able to attend school. I had excelled at, and enjoyed, mathematics whilst at primary school, and there was even a mention of grammar school at some point. However, within my family, no emphasis was ever put onto the value of education, and I was often ridiculed for wanting to do well. It's not that I didn't enjoy school. It was simply that all the moving around as a child had taken its toll. Changing schools, making friends, getting settled, having routine, moving, losing friends, then doing it all over again. Then, there was the fascination that surrounds the new kid at school. I was at that age where I knew that I was poor and was ashamed of my family, and it was my own insecurities that made me an easy target for the bullies. The only difference was that I wouldn't take any crap, and by this point enjoyed the thrill of the fight. So began the pattern of suspension and suspension before eventually being expelled. After several evaluations, I was in due course sent to Ingledene Children's Home in Salford. My initial impression was that the place was a dump. The furniture was damaged, wall-mounted pictures smashed, and the floor and walls were ripped and full of stains. It was a mixed-sex home that dealt exclusively with secondary school kids. Entering a children's home is no different from entering a new school. There is a hierarchy in place amongst the established kids, a social structure, a balance of power that everyone understands and respects. I would eventually disregard this, but not before I hit rock bottom. My social worker had managed to pull some strings and get me accepted into one of the local schools on the sole provision that I wouldn't get into more trouble whilst attending. She was very precise that this was my last chance at an education, explaining unequivocally that under no circumstances was I to engage in any forms of fighting whilst at school. 1 week later, I was expelled. However, to this day, I would still argue that the fight didn't happen on school grounds. So technically, should I have been expelled? However, I was wearing the school uniform at the time. I was still accountable. My social worker, as one can reasonably imagine, was pissed off at me. And I can understand why. For the rest of the school year, I completed the occasional piece of work from home and had the usual end-of-year exams to sit. Surprisingly enough, I did reasonably well with little effort, despite very little interest. The only upside to being expelled, again, was that I was a hero within the children's home, as I had gained a temporary cult status there. Even the older kids were impressed, some of them significantly older at 17 years old, and to gain their respect at that time of my life seemed important. The months quickly passed, and some kids moved on. The younger ones fostered or reunited with their families, and older ones progressing to a 16-plus unit. Drugs were always being used by the majority of the kids. They often attempted to peer pressure me into taking them, but unsuccessfully. I despised drugs, as I had witnessed the damaging effects they had had on my family. In many ways, it was easier to be accepted by this group, and, for a short time, I thought of them as my new family. At first glance, we had so much in common. We were all from similar backgrounds, had all been neglected or abused, some physically, some sexually, and others both. They all gave the steadfast impression that they were all the toughest person in the room, and as such, were not to be trifled with. Challenge accepted. Thieving was a common occurrence amongst the residents of Ingledean, and this group would steal anything from anyone. There was no honour amongst these thieves. All of them smoked and took drugs, and for them, thieving was a means to an end. This was not fundamentally who I was, but I was desperate to fit in. I still refused the cigarettes and the drugs, but my short-lived cult status had expired, and one of the older lads had recently discovered an unlocked and unguarded computer room at the neighbouring hospital. The plan was set, and I had agreed to take part, but only as the lookout. I wanted the slightest involvement possible, and it was in the early hours that we conducted our caper. I was oblivious and naive to what we were stealing, who we were selling it to, and for how much. With less than 15 minutes into my first criminal act, I had an epiphany. Despite my unconventional upbringing, I was aware that this was deeply and categorically wrong, and that the path that I was on was a one-way street to prison. Something had to give. Once I abandoned my post and returned to Ingledean, I was aware that I would now be an outcast amongst the other kids. Although we shared so many similarities and experiences, at my core, I was different. I had a conscience, and was unreservedly ashamed of what we had just participated in. I had anticipated that the other kids would be missing for a few days, revelling in the spoils of their criminality. But once they returned, I would have to face the consequences of my actions. My punishment came in many forms, such as social exile, the theft of my clothes and personal items, and the constant trashing of my room, but only the threats of being beaten up. This surprised me. Why only threats? These were older kids, bigger than me. What were they waiting for? It soon became apparent that these kids were only confident and aggressive when they were collectively together. And if I wanted this torment to stop, then the best solution would be to confront them individually. And that is exactly what I did. Lee was the oldest, by now 16 years old and 2 years my senior. When passing the staff officer, I carelessly informed the 2 members of staff who were sat casually drinking coffee that I was going upstairs to move some furniture, and that if they heard some bangs, not to be alarmed. They secretly knew what was about to happen, but didn't much care. I recall kicking open the door to Lee's room and immediately saw a different side of him. He was afraid, terrified even. I had trained in martial arts from an early age and knew how to throw an effective punch, but was surprised how effortlessly Lee was knocked to the ground. Lee was over 6 foot tall, but of a slender build, and during the previous months of hanging out and getting up to mischief, Lee had convinced me that he was a brutal fighter, and had told many tales of his exploits. Now the reality was, he was cowering and crying at my feet. I was confused. I hadn't expected this. So what do I do now? I kicked him in the stomach and informed him that things were going to change at Ingledean for the better. It didn't take long for the others to step into line as, at their heart, they were all cowards, whether they wanted to believe it or not. The only ramification from my actions occurred a few weeks later in the hallway outside the staff offices at Ingledean. Lee was accompanied by another large, stockier young man of around 17 or 18 years old. They were arguing, and it was getting heated, until this bloke saw me. We made eye contact. Everyone knew what this meant, and what was about to happen. I charged rapidly at him, lunging low and then high in a spear-type rugby tackle, knocking the wind out of him and slamming him to the floor before repeatedly punching him with wild blows to the face. Lee abandoned his friend and ran off, whilst the remaining 2 staff struggled to restrain me before Lee's so-called muscle also departed. Needless to say, I was never bothered at Ingledean again, and I was about to make some productive changes. Lee immediately requested to be moved to a 16+, and once he had moved out, gradual changes were implemented. The staff explained to us all that being in a children's home could have many benefits. For a start, you get a gym pass, a clothing allowance, as well as a cash allocation for weekly recreational activities. But only if you were well behaved, of course. I was always active as a kid and embraced the gym, played sports, and now studied karate at the local leisure centre. I persuaded the other kids not to damage Ingledean anymore, as this was our home, and we had to live there. We gradually received new furniture, a pool table, and the building was even redecorated. The residents gradually began to stop attacking the staff. However, some needed that little bit more persuasion than others. I look back fondly at these years, as for the first time in my life, I was experiencing the much-needed stability and routine that I needed. Ingledean provided me with a routine, no question. Meal times were rigid. We were routinely woken up for breakfast, had a curfew, and fixed lights-out times. We had strict rules to follow, and were rewarded for good behaviour, although I did still occasionally break them. I was thriving inside this new environment, and was even allowed back into Wentworth High School, despite my previous violent acts. My social worker was a miracle worker, and I was determined not to squander away this last chance at an education. I returned to school midway through the 4th year of secondary school. I was no longer an angry, frustrated young man, as I finally had routine at home, albeit a children's home. I wasn't conscious of who I wanted to be, but more so, who I didn't want to be. In short, my parents. They would now become the motivation I needed to succeed in life. But I was unsure of where I was going, or what I wanted to achieve as adulthood loomed. Bizarrely, I was made a prefect at school, probably a first at Ingledean, and I achieved modest GCSE results, with B grades in both maths and English. However, school was over, and I would soon be 17, and wouldn't be able to stay at Ingledean for much longer. Once I'd finished my limited schooling, the next transition in the care system was to move to a sheltered 16-plus unit, and I knew that, from the outset, this wasn't the place for me. These were generally unsupervised bedsits, where vulnerable young adults were exploited, and I knew that this was not the environment I wanted to live in. The manager of Ingledean was a mountain of a man, a former prop forward for Widnes, and he would heavily influence my career choices. We would often play chess together, and he would fondly speak about his own son, who was flourishing in the British Army. Maybe this was his way of planting a subliminal seed. And I'm sure that he was happy when I decided that I was going to apply to sign up and follow in his own son's footsteps. Whilst writing this chapter and reflecting back on some of my childhood experiences, I believe that I was very fortunate to be self-aware of my own actions whilst in my teenage years. It was this ability to analyse one's own actions that prevented me from slipping into a life of criminality. This ability would also be instrumental when self-analysing my actions throughout my military journey, then later on, by helping me to acknowledge the symptoms of battlefield trauma within myself. Maybe this was a contributing factor that also led to, and subsequently fed on, my own deteriorating mental health, as from its very inception, I would often beat myself up about my failed actions, or, sometimes, inaction. I would repeatedly ask myself the questions: could I have done more? Should I have done more? More often than not, I felt like I was carrying the weight of the nation on my shoulders, and at times, I genuinely believed that I was solely accountable for all military actions. But was this linked to childhood trauma? Research has found that soldiers, particularly those who are minors and those from disadvantaged backgrounds, are more susceptible to the risk of some mental health problems than their adult counterparts. Those from adverse backgrounds were up to 4 times more likely to suffer with their mental health later on in life. And from a 2016 study, it is argued that this is due to the development of parts other than cognitive in the brain throughout adolescence. I do acknowledge that there is some truth that links military PTSD to childhood trauma. But in my circumstances, I do not feel that this is the case. Whilst undergoing several different therapies to treat my own psychological trauma, I found that acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, was the most effective. I believe that this was because, even as a child, I had accepted the trauma I had experienced instead of suppressing those memories. It was normal to be beaten on a regular basis by your parents, especially if you were troublesome like myself. However, despite this, one could quite easily conclude that it is the impact from your childhood experiences that moulds and determines your adult character and behavioural patterns. Therefore, childhood trauma would inevitably influence and sometimes determine your decisions later on in life. Nevertheless, I fundamentally disagree with the concept of what is categorized as a normal childhood. Because as a child, you have no control over the experiences and life lessons that effectively mould your character into adulthood. Thus, from a child's perspective, especially mine, all childhoods are normal. Years later, whilst attending university, I would be introduced to the theory of social structures that essentially determines most of our adult characteristics, and, in most cases, sets the limits on our life opportunities. However, I would argue that the agency of individual actions is more definitive than the shackles of the social standing that we are born into. Thankfully, this audiobook isn't about the social economic divide. You're welcome. Having said that, it was my structure. A robust teenager from a council estate, streetwise, and a scrapper from a broken home who seemed to thrive in the British Army. It would be foolish not to highlight this relationship, as it is no coincidence that there is a certain stereotype who are drawn into military service. More specifically, the infantry. In my circumstance, it was the romanticism that is associated with warfare that had attracted me to join the ranks of the British Army.